Romanian initiative at the History and Public Policy program. Those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center, the Wilson Center is the nation's official living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. It is a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue. It brings preeminent thinkers to Washington for extended periods of time to interact with policymakers through a large number of programs and projects. The center seeks to separate the important from the inconsequential and to take a historical and broad perspective on the issues. At the Wilson Center, the History and Public Policy program and the Cold War International History Project support the full and prompt release of historical materials by governments on all sides of the Cold War and seek to accelerate the process of integrating new sources, materials, and perspective from the former communist bloc with a historiography of the Cold War. It also seeks to transcend barriers of language, geography, and regional specialty to create new links among scholars interested in Cold War history. Among the activities undertaken by the program, the project, are the publication of bulletins and working papers available outside, the organization of international conferences, scholarly conferences, and oral history conferences, as well as a series of seminars discussing new research, much like the one today. Part of the History and Public Policy program, the Romania Initiative seeks to bring to Washington young Romanian scholars interested in Romanian history and Romania's role, not just in the Cold War, but in general throughout the 20th and now the 21st century. Mihail Neamtu is the second of the young Romanian scholars at the Wilson Center through a cooperation project with the Romanian Cultural Institute. He will be presenting today not his project here at the center, but something he's been working on over the past few years, I take it. And that is to look at Romania's intelligentsia during the Cold War, during the reign of Ceausescu. And to put that in perspective, it's particularly important because we don't, when you think about the Cold War, you don't usually think about culture as a weapon in the Cold War. However, as several people have argued in the past, the Cold War was kept cold by military might. It was, however, won by culture and ideology, primarily the ideology of the West and the ideas of liberty and freedom and the pursuit of happiness. So I think Mihail will speak for about 40 minutes about a little-known subject, and that is Romania's dissident movement, Romania's intellectual dissidents during the Cold War and after, and then I'll make some comments and then we'll open it up to question and answers. So, there you go.
Thank you, Mircea. Thank you very much. Let me just salute the idealist who wanted to come to attend a lecture about the Romanian resistance against communism through culture, as Mircea has just said. And I should like to begin by drawing your attention to the major framework that I'm considering here, namely the presence of Romania in the larger concert of dissident voices from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, who happen to be better known by the West nowadays. I will talk, however, about a particular figure who is very well known in Romania, but less known here, and who, together with other friends, and I call them idealists because they tended to be philosophers and poets, have organized a cultural resistance during the 80s and the 70s. And at the heart of this movement, I can call it a movement, perhaps Professor Andrei Pleșu, a former Minister of Culture and an ex-Minister of Foreign Affairs in Romania, has redefined the horizon and the themes of our debate in the 70s and the 80s. His biography includes not only impressive scholarly achievements, who have been, by the way, we have been celebrating him in Romania and in Western Europe with his Festschrift. You can pass it over if you please. He's very well known in Germany and Switzerland in particular. But apart from being an important, as I said, scholar in the field of religious studies, Professor Pleshu has been also a reformist figure of our post-communist transition. The 1989 anniversary of the fall of communism in Eastern Europe should incorporate, I'd argue, this less known and yet equally powerful story of a Romanian public intellectual who, throughout various strategies of underground resistance, have both mocked and usurped the power of totalitarian regime. He was once called, defined or presented by a major German sociologist, Wolf Lepenis. He was called dieser Spezialist für Zwischentöne und Zwischenwesen, which is the specialist of intermediary tones and essences, and you will not be surprised to find out that he's also a very close friend of Adam Michnik. Professor Pleshu will, I think, attend an important conference this autumn in Washington, so some of you might have the opportunity to talk to him in person. But while talking about him as an individual, I'd like to walk you through a series of important political and cultural events that have defined Romania under communism and the neighboring countries. Who is Andrei Pleshu? Well, he was born in 1948. This should work. Does it work?
Yeah.
Okay. Into the bourgeois family of Radu Pleshu, who was a surgeon, and his mother Zoe, at a time when the Russian troops were still on the Romanian territory. In this world of whispers, as Feigis would put it, he first stepped into a primary school in Sinaia in 1955, and then he went to a village school in the village of Pskov in Moldavia, where his father was a doctor. I mention this because he spent many childhood summers in this rural area, in this countryside, in a place which was very beautiful, a highland that had once been covered by centuries-old forests, excellent pastures, orchards, even crops, and mountains that were rocky, clay, and totally bare. As with Alexander Solzhenitsyn and other Eastern European writers over the years, the experience of rural life proved to be decisive for Professor Pleshu. The spontaneous, natural character of a world that was later disfigured by collectivization has always represented a benchmark of integrity. Without necessarily stimulating structural nostalgia for an agrarian utopia, the memory of the village prevented the urban alienation that might come sometimes with an uncritical acceptance of modernity. In the late 1950s, the countryside could still reveal a pre-modern age buried deep in the strata of everyday life. The village was a mirror of durable values, building character, while at the same time allowing room for inertias that do not usually exist in an urban civilization. After primary and secondary school, Andrei Pleshu graduated at the top of his class from the humanities section of the well-known Lycée Spiru Haret, which was attended by major interwar intellectuals in Romania at that time. Dating from this period, his friendship with an intimate of a monastery, an Orthodox monastery from Bucharest, would have strong spiritual echoes throughout the following decades for Mr. Pleshu. Between 1966 and 1971, he distinguished himself as a brilliant student in the Department of Art History at the University of Bucharest. But what was the cultural milieu in which the young Andrei Pleshu and his idealist friends developed intellectually and came into his own? He made his debut in 1968, the summer unsettled by the Cultural Revolution at the Sorbonne in Paris, and brutalized by the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. As he would later confess, Andrei Pleshu was not impressed by the leftist hysteria embraced by so many Western intellectuals at that point. I quote, May 68, August 68. Paris and Prague. Two poles of a world turned upside down, and ultimately two of Brezhnev's victories. France without de Gaulle and Czechoslovakia without Dubček. The first case employed the procedure of democratic barricade. The second, that of brotherly help. Students manipulated, if only by their own rhetoric, their own ideological smugness, and soldiers manipulated, if only by their own ignorance or the political barbarism of their superiors. The former, as well as the latter, exercised to the benefit of future generations the technique of innocent assassination. End of quote. Such an assessment helps us better understand his affinities with the thought of Alexis de Tocqueville and Raymond Aron. In December 1996, a famous Romanian journalist questioned Andrei Pleșu, "Since when have you been an anti-communist?" To which he replied promptly, "Ever since I can remember." The explanation follows. I grew up surrounded by a family that, just like many other Romanian and Russian and Czech families, suffered greatly as a result of the communist regime. When I became myself aware of the things that were happening, and he was alluding to the concentration camps that you've just seen before, the things that were being said and written, I quickly understood that I was living in a phony world, an aggressively phony world. Now, the beginning of Professor Andrei Pleșu's professional career coincided with the proclamation of the famous July theses, through which Nicolae Ceausescu, who just visited North Korea and North Vietnam in, I think, 1971, right?
June, July 71.
He just after that, after visiting North Korea and North Vietnam, Nicolae Ceausescu banned, I quote, the manifestations of cosmopolitanism and, quote again, artistic models borrowed from the capitalist world. It was a period marked by institutional constraints hardly imaginable now, at least from a Western academic perspective. Purchases of foreign books declined. Debates among academic specialists were relegated to peripheral areas, while freedom of expression and access to information were heavily censored by the organs of the party and the state. So how could one escape, even if fleetingly, the blind contingency of such a history? How could one, such as Andrei Pleșu, feed his personal need for theoretical depth, which had been secretly nourished by a legitimate precocity? What was the general framework for Andrei Pleșu and these other Romanian idealists? What was the framework for their evolution in this context? Well, the official regime had just lapsed into dogmatism, demanding, I quote, the extension and intensification of atheistic propaganda, this is July 1971, on the level of the masses, with the aim of, quote, combating mysticism and retrograde ideas to further the process of educating the youth in the spirit of materialist dialectical philosophy, which this meant, of course, the banning of singing of carols during Christmas time and so on. Now, anticipating the program of rural and urban systematization, the same regime also launched the project of ideological and cultural engineering. In such an age, tormented as it was by the litanies of the inverted religion of communism, the chances of a genuine survival of a passion for culture, nature, and the art in general were anything but assured. The young Andrei Pleșu benefited, however, from the guidance of some erudite mentors, most of them just emerging from the communist prisons. There were elderly senior figures such as Alexandru Paleologu, Petre Țuțea, and Nicolae Steinhardt, but also younger friends such as Ioan Petru Culianu, the disciple of Mircea Eliade, killed in 1991 at the University of Chicago, and then Gabriel Liceanu, the philosopher, who accompanied Andrei Pleșu throughout his life, and then other friends, including the painter Horia Berna, who is depicted, I think, at the far right there. So this was the context for a personal intellectual formation. With the help of these friends, he managed, Andrei Pleșu, to explore inaccessible libraries, to open locked doors, to read prohibited books, always trying to probe forbidden subjects. He defied the suspicions of professional censors by constantly returning to the great books tradition and to the invisible springs of Western civilization, which for him comprised Constantinople, Rome, Moscow, Berlin, Paris, London, and of course Washington, D.C. Now, this intense commerce of ideas gave birth to a series of articles published in various journals, and as well as prefaces and afterwards published in several important translations in the area of art history. In 1971, the young and brilliant Andrei Pleșu introduced to the Romanian public the work of Camille Jean-Baptiste Corot, the French landscape painter who became a master of painting en plein air. This was followed by a volume called Journey into the World of Forms, published in 1974, and then a doctoral thesis called Melancholy and the Picturesque. You see there the cover. Another essay on Francesco Guardi, published in 1981, and then a rich collection of essays published on the same topic, The Eye and the Things, in 1986. So this is how he distinguished himself first, as an art historian, a brilliant art historian, and this is the first phase, almost like in Kierkegaard's famous dialectics, or the stages of one's life. First the aesthetics, you'll see then the ethical dimension, and at the end, perhaps I'll have some time to talk about the religious side of it. Now, another senior professor who survived the communist prison, who was his mentor in the field of art history, Ion Frunzeti, prefaced Andrei Pleșu's first book, which was published again when he was only 26, and used some very emphatic statements. Let me just quote a few. Professor Ion Frunzeti, the mentor of Andrei Pleșu in the field of art history. What struck me from the very first moments of my intellectual exchanges, first as a teacher and later as an older friend with the student Andrei Pleșu, was not only his great capacity to articulate precisely, clearly, and at the same time subtly what he had to say, and especially what he chose to share of his thoughts on the cultural facts he studied. There was also a sense, in addition to the usual senses that people have developed, a sense which led him to the essence of visual facts and their expression, where many of the senior professionals of the guild, the art historians, got lost in perorations about secondary matters, mistaken for the essential. He, the young, the junior, the student, ingeniously solved everything with grace. This is Andrei Pleșu at the age of 26. Now, the first volume that he published centered around various notions such as experimentation with happiness, life, and circumscribed his forays into the history of Western art. He looked at medieval painters like Van Gogh, Klee, and also Petrașcu, the Romanian. And there were some other recurrent motives in his writings, such as the encounter of the soul with the mystery of being, the melancholy of the creator, but also the crushing power of the feminine and the discreet stirring of nature. In this way, I think Pleșu understood the great imperative of somebody like Václav Havel, who called for this life in truth. It was not related to history necessarily, it wasn't related to politics for a start, but it was a way of life which I think contemplated the mystery of being in a way that nourished later on many generations of students. It's also interesting to look at the footnotes that he used in this doctoral thesis, again written in the late 70s, at a time when Romania was cut off from Western Europe. There was just one exception, but I'll come back to it. The relationship between the Federal Republic of Germany and Romania, which had a different sort of nuance there. But the footnotes of this doctoral research are interesting because they show the universal drive of Andrei Pleșu as a thinker, as a philosopher. He quotes from John Ruskin and Ernst Gombrich, from Heinrich Zimmer to Karl Kerényi, but also he uses subversive writers such as Saint Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, Basil the Great, Plotinus, and Plato. Again, at a time when these sources were not available in the ordinary bookshops. Of course, he did that in order to study the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, Bruegel the Young, Nicolas Poussin, Caspar David Friedrich, John Constable, and William Turner. He explores the issue of nature and the way in which modernity has stripped nature of superstition and enchantment, the perception of nature of superstition and enchantment, but also the way in which older cosmologies, older ways of looking at the world, idealize nature. Nature is a goddess, but also a terrain for our transformative imagination. What I would like, however, to emphasize here is the primacy of the contemplative instinct for this intellectual in his fight against the ideological utopia of communism. In a world impoverished by the nationalist communist parody and fatigued by the paranoid spectacle staged around the great leader, Andrei Pleșu, together with other colleagues, took refuge in the school of the great masters, locked in their studios and discreetly affirmed in art museums, catalogues, and albums. Loving European painting with passion and discernment helped him to acquire and to grasp the minute details of this art history, the pleasure of style, and the irresistible inclination towards literary perfection. His insights into this atemporal character of artistic inspiration, however, did not lead him to evade the rhythms of history. Andrei Pleșu, like other philosophers from Eastern Europe, read methodically the classics of philosophy. Think of Patočka here in Czech Republic, and other philosophers from Hungary and Poland, Kolakowski among others. He did that while skimming through with selectivity and penetration the instances of truth to be found in the present day affairs of the world. Now, there's an important moment which occurs, and I'll refer to it, you see here the picture, which occurs in the late 70s and the early 80s in Andrei Pleșu's biography. But before that, let me say that in the late 70s, more specifically from 1975 to 1977, a surprising university offer opened for Andrei Pleșu, together with his good friend Gabriel Iceanu, the philosopher, the way towards several research fellowships in Germany, in the Federal Republic, more specifically in Bonn, Dortmund, Heidelberg, and Freiburg. His two visits to the free territory of the Federal Republic of Germany prepared what I would argue to be the ethical stage in his intellectual trajectory. This journey to Germany, of course, allowed him to familiarize with major classics of German thought, from Heidegger to Carl Gustav Jung, to prepare the bibliography of the Romanian edition of Plato's works, because they were translated at that time, but also to enter into the domain of international political debate. These were the years in which the protest movements in Czechoslovakia, the Charter 77 manifesto conceived by Havel and his friends, began to reverberate across the borders of the socialist bloc. It was in Germany when he got in touch with people working for the Radio Free Europe in France, and especially here I'm referring to the famous couple Monica Lovinescu and Virgilia Runca, the major Romanian journalist who worked for the Radio Free Europe in Paris, and Monica Lovinescu being also beaten by the Securitatea, trying to resist, of course, in those gloomy years. Now, upon his return back home, Andrei Pleșu and Gabriel Liceanu and other idealists found that the personality cult of Nicolae Ceausescu was growing stronger. Poverty and misery cast their long shadow over daily life. The conditions of scholars worsened in equal measure with the life of the peasants, dispossessed of their land, dignity and hope. The Minister of Internal Affairs strictly forbade the borrowing or renting of typewriters. One could not own a typewriter in those days. On March 6, 1983, President Ronald Reagan proposed the suspension of the most favored nation status, which had been previously applied to socialist Romania. In the meantime, with the help of Radio Free Europe, the diaspora, the Romanian diaspora, but the diaspora in general, discovered with great joy and optimism this new generation of philosophers who were not necessarily dissidents in the classical sense of the term, but who were trying to provide an alternative model with respect to the definition of the public intellectual. And these young philosophers were trained by a major, crucial figure of Romanian culture, Constantin Noica, who was arguably the greatest Romanian philosopher of the 20th century. A prodigy attracted first by poetry and literary writings, who in the early 30s received his major from the University of Bucharest with a thesis on Kant, and who also spent long research terms in Paris and Berlin in those years, while writing different scholarly studies on Descartes, Leibniz and Kant. For only a very brief period of time, I should mention, from the summer of 1940 to the following winter, the young Noica expressed, to his later regret, his sympathies with the far-right legionary movement. However, he repudiated this traumatic episode, for which he also paid dearly during his time under house arrest from 1949 to 1958, and during his imprisonment under the communist regime from 1958 to 1964. After his release from prison, Constantin Noica worked intensely on some major topics of continental philosophy. He wrote on Hegel's logic and phenomenology, but also he translated a large amount of classical sources: Plato, Aristotle, Porphyry, Ammonius, Augustine, Descartes. A really major undertaking which dramatically changed the philosophical landscape, which was dominated at the time by the Marxist ideology. He also encouraged and privately trained, for free of course, free of charge, young scholars in the field of classical languages, Latin and Greek. This is what attracted Andrei Pleșu and Gabriel Liceanu with respect to the great personality and charisma of Constantin Noica. This possibility of bracketing the evil of history and entering into a greater, bigger conversation with the great minds of Western history of metaphysics, Plato, Aristotle, Kant and Hegel, but also with other authors such as Cervantes, Goethe and Nietzsche. This was allowed, enabled by the presence of Constantin Noica, but not in the city, not in Bucharest, but rather in the mountains, literally in the mountains. He emulated Constantin Noica, of course, the example, the model of Martin Heidegger, who had his own Hütte in Germany, and who withdrew in order to write his major work. And this happened, this encounter, this these constant visits were paid by Andrei Pleșu and Gabriel Liceanu, starting with the late 70s until the mid 80s. They were commuting from Bucharest to Păltiniș, which is a pretty famous resort in the Carpathians. And again, they were enabled rather to leave behind the petty disputes with representatives of the party, with the apparatchiks, and they were encouraged by these great men to enter the bigger debates about perennial ideas, about philosophical systems, and of course they were encouraged, which was a crucial thing for their generation, to acquire the highest standards of Western scholarship. They learned the languages, and since especially Constantin Noica noticed that at the age of 30 Andrei Pleșu already had what he called a dangerous quantum of cultural hooliganism, Andrei Pleșu was punished with a very severe schedule. He had to pass the test of 10 hours of classical Greek per day for a while, and apparently he successfully won the prize. This is what happened in the 80s with a number of Romanian intellectuals who later on, I emphasize this, became crucial figures in our post-1989 political and cultural debates. Now, with regards to a more personal aspect of Andrei Pleșu's biography, I should like to mention that in 1982 he was barred for political reasons from university teaching. That's related to a stupid and artificial scandal around the transcendental meditation. I will not go into detail here, but he just attended a talk given at an institute for psychology, and since that wasn't supervised by the party, he was later on, as I said, dismissed from teaching. Between 1982 and 1983, he became a consultant at the Artists' Union. Then he was demoted from to the position of documentalist at the Institute of Art History in Bucharest. And again, in those years, the working conditions were terrible. They included all forms of humiliation and frustration, cold, hunger, and fear of denunciation. These were the ingredients of a lifestyle of cultural survival. On May 1st, the Workers' Day, and August 23rd, the Liberation Day for Communist Romania, nobody was exempt from the obligation of a personal sacrifice. The columns of resigned bodies and red banners on the altar of the great leader's madness. In such a context, and following the death of his beloved mentor and teacher, Constantin Noica, who passed away in 1987, Andrei Pleșu decided to make a step forward. From the field of art history and aesthetics, he moved into the field of ethics. And I think this is a crucial aspect here. And again, it echoes what happened to other Eastern European philosophers. In 1988, he published a very short volume, but very dense, called Minima Moralia, Elements for an Ethics of the Interval, which included famous texts on culture and wisdom, Tears, The Solitude of Robinson Crusoe, The Unhappiness of Falstaff, with reference, of course, to Shakespeare's play, and so on and so forth. Now, the book contains not only memorable formulations on the relationship between the soul and the ethical absolute, but also frequently touches upon the moral condition of the Romanian intellectual at that point. There was a sense of shame, I think, which he perceived, Andrei Pleșu, because in contrast to many of the Poles, of the Polish intellectuals, who gathered together in the movement Solidarność, or cooperated with the Roman Catholic Church, the Romanian scholars had by and large abdicated from the duty of civic alertness. In a community profoundly altered by the imperatives of the multilaterally developed society, the writings of Andrei Pleșu, in particular this essay, Minima Moralia, disturbed the somnolence of the majority. In those days, in the late 80s, the Romanian intellectuals embraced this theory of adaptation to the times. And this theory was based on the following argument. Considering that communism was modernizing the life of the Romanians, which was a modernity proved, of course, by many patriotic construction sites, including the big channel that connects Danube to the Black Sea, under this pretext that, of course, communism was modernizing the life of the Romanians, some intellectuals, many of them, used the mantra of technical progress and, of course, accepted a decline into cowardice. Allegiance to the system became rather unproblematic in a country full of the engineers and technicians, born of the 5-year plans, from the second cabinet of Elena Ceausescu to the last agricultural farm in the hills of Dobrogea. Everybody was obsessed with the 5-year plan. The idea of, and progress, the idea of moral fallibility was overshadowed by the pursuit of physical survival. The opinion leaders of the Romanian society justified their moral resignation through a pathetic involvement in a comradely competition meant to create yet another school, yet another agricultural complex, yet another factory, and even, I quote from our former patriarch of the Orthodox Church, a leading ecclesiastical jurisdiction. This was all in the light of this notion of progress. And a clear index of this totalitarian malformation was the disappearance of any sense of the ridiculous, the gradual loss of humor, in short, the abolition of the capacity to distance oneself from the minor or major problems of everyday life. This was the context in which Minima Moralia appeared, and of course it shocked a number of readers. Now, the Securitatea, the former Romanian Secret Service at that point, had already ruthlessly crushed the dissidents of some emblematic figures such as Doina Cornea, Dorin Tudoran, and Dan Petrescu. We are now in 1988, and in an interview for Radio Moscow, this is August 1988, Mircea Dinescu, an important poet at that time, bravely praised Gorbachev's reforms. On March 17, the author of A Drinking Bout with Marx, that was a volume he published, declared in the French journal Libération that human rights were systematically being violated. Along with 6 other intellectuals, Andrei Pleșu signed a letter of support for Mircea Dinescu. The official reaction was merciless. All the signatories, with the exception of the anti-fascist veteran Joe Bogza, were prohibited from publishing. Andrei Pleșu, I think for the 3rd time in the 80s, lost his position at the Institute of Art History. And on April 5th, after being illegally put on unemployment, began his exile to Tescan. Now, Tescan was a village in Moldavia, maybe 300 kilometers away from Bucharest. Again, one of the most gifted Romanian intellectuals loses his job and he is sent into exile for an indeterminate period. Later he obtained the position of a librarian with a PhD, and his family was put under strict surveillance until the end of May. Now the Securitatea continued to survey his family until December 1989, browbeating any friend, relative or acquaintance who desired to express their loyalty. At Tescan, or in Tescan, Pleșu deepened his ethical reflection, and I think it's in Tescan where he more radically undertakes a religious reflection upon the meaning of life. You can imagine in that sort of solitary condition, he started to read more theological material. He read the Bible, the patristic commentators from Dionysius the Areopagite to Anselm of Canterbury, and he spent a lot of time reflecting upon the relationship between faith and reason. I'll speed up here in order to give you a brief account of what happened after 1989, but not before. Let me just quote a very nice sentence from his diary, which he wrote in Tescan, which sounds like this. To us, he said, this is in October 1989, when he didn't know whether he will make it or not, through this exile period, all obstacles appear as walls. The trick is to treat them as mirrors or windows, to allow them to reflect us, or to see through them a transcendent horizon. But it is not only obstacles that appear as walls, he wrote. Anything can become a wall if it functions as a blockage. A good opportunity, success, even happiness, good and evil are without discrimination potential walls. One must polish them until they become reflexive and transparent. This is a piece of Andrei Pleșu's wisdom. Now, after 1989, to his great surprise, the prestige surrounding his writings in particular, but also his charisma, made him be appointed as Minister of Culture from 1990 to 1991. His name is related to the founding of the first museum of the Romanian peasant. He contributed to the creation of an institute for Oriental Studies. He became a founding member of the group for social dialogue. He witnessed with great horror the violent manifestation from Bucharest on June 13th, from June 13th to June 15th, and in 1991 he resigned. He resigned because he wasn't happy with the way the new government was trying to implement the reforms, and he went to lecture at the newly regenerated Department of Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. We are in 1994 to 1996 when basically the halls where Andrei Pleșu were filled with hundreds and hundreds of students, transfixed by the magnetism of his ideas, the goodwill of the speaker, the cleverness of his answers to their questions. He started to lecture abroad as well. He was invited to be a visiting professor at the University of Berkeley. He became a permanent fellow at Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. He became, of course, he got several honorary doctorates from Albert Ludwig Universität in Freiburg in Breisgau and Humboldt University in Berlin. He founded a journal and then called Dilemma, and then in 1997, in a pretty complicated political context, when Yugoslavia was being bombed by the Americans, he became Minister of Foreign Affairs, which complicated a bit his job. But he, apart from the public stance, I must mention that he was courageous enough to introduce some young diplomats in the corpus of our Minister of Foreign Affairs, young figures at that point who now are doing a very good job for the Romanian community abroad, in particular. One more thing, he founded with the help of some German and Swiss foundations, private foundations, the only private institute, truly private, who never got money from the state, an institute for advanced studies in the field of humanities called New Europe College. And since 1994, more than 600 young students attended the lectures there, the seminars and so on, and I think became part of the intellectual and political elite of Romania. Let me just conclude. In this presentation, I've tried to portray the intellectual trajectory of one of the most gifted European intellectuals, whose achievements in the public sphere have been compared to those of Václav Havel or Adam Michnik. I have also identified a specific dialectic in Andrei Pleșu's stages of life, which show him as a solitary researcher, but also as a very astute and gifted public intellectual of unequaled success. The historians of Eastern Europe and of Romanian culture under communism will discover a plurality of voices meeting under the same signature, sometimes disputing their relative supremacy. This, I would suggest, this is why we should recognize the principal qualities of Andrei Pleșu's life and work. Andrei Pleșu, who never ceased to deepen his existential inquiries while building bridges between cultures and spheres of life that tend not to talk to each other. He also reenacted throughout his life, at times, the miracle of generosity towards his past mentors, generosity towards his contemporary audience, and generosity towards the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mihail. It's just fascinating insight into the life and evolution of Andrei Pleșu. Let me just make a few comments before we open it up for discussion. We began this the seminar by talking about by pointing out that while the Cold War might have been cold because of weapons, it was one in the field of ideas, and while the field of the historiography of the culture in the Cold War has been limited to some extent in recent times, it is picking up, and it is picking up because people are beginning to realize the importance that ideas and people, personalities of intellectuals had in the evolution of the Cold War and the way it ended. I do not see an end to the Cold War outside of the context of, for example, Basket 3 of the Helsinki Accords that dealt with human rights, with the freedom of circulation, with the freedom of ideas. To talk about, we've listened to a presentation about Andrei Pleșu as a dissident, and what I was hoping to get more out of it was a context in which Pleșu's dissidence manifested itself in Romania. It was certainly not operating in the same way as some of the other Romanian dissidents. And the problem here is that we haven't really discussed Romanian dissidents almost at all, just generally, not just in this particular meeting, but generally we haven't really touched upon the Romanian dissidents and what that meant and who were the people behind it and the ideas behind it. It was certainly a dissident in his own way, and a recent book just published by Vladislav Zubak on Russian intelligentsia and the Russian dissidents dealt with this dilemma between conformity and dissidence that intellectuals felt in the Soviet Union, especially intellectuals that experienced the relative, and I do stress relative, thaw of Nikita Khrushchev, and were then forced into the conformity of Leonid Brezhnev and his clamp down on ideas and liberties. In much the same way, Andrei Pleșu experienced a similar fate. He graduates and goes on in a period of relative thawing in Romania in the late 60s and very early 70s. and right at his beginning, at the beginning of his career, he's faced with a clampdown on his ability to produce his ideas and to produce intellectual property, basically. I think his way of dissidence, by reading your paper and your research, I think his way of dissidence was to remove himself from the grasp of the party and state. His dissidence was to not participate, to take away, to deny his intelligence and his brilliance to the state, to not put it in the service of a communist ideology that he disagreed with.
But also to publicly express his solidarity with Mircea Dinescu, which was a courageous thing.
I'll get to that. And that's how he began his dissonance. And it's very hard to explain, and I think you should stress that in later versions of it more. It's very hard to explain to people that are not familiar with Romania's communist history the oppression felt by individuals from the state, especially in the late 70s, but especially in the 80s. It is really hard to explain to people the feeling of insecurity that one had. So within that context, even removing himself from the ability of the state to use his intelligence and his person was a courageous act. He is, as I see it, a dissident in the same vein that other Romanian intellectuals like Marian Preda or Nikita Stănescu were dissidents, criticizing the government by refusing to conform, rather than by bluntly stating the obvious. By the time, however, you get into the very late 80s, into 88 and 89, it becomes apparent that that even someone described as a specialist in intermediary tones and intermediary essences can no longer take an intermediary route. His act of supporting and criticizing the activities, again, of supporting Mircea Dinescu and criticizing the activities of the Securitate and the regime against him was certainly a combative step that is not that doesn't seem to be in his nature. I think, however, that Pleshu was much more prepared to be a dissident, and I do think of him as a dissident in the post-communist Romania. He was. It suited and it suits his personality, I think, and his intellectual preparation much better to be a voice of reason and a voice of clarity in a country that had a difficult transition to say the least. It is not subtracted from his accomplishments in pre-1989. Prior to the revolution of 1989, but it certainly, I think, places them into context, and I think he was, and I would argue he was much better prepared for the role he had there. He was often a voice of moral standing, and while maybe less strident than some of the other former dissidents, like Mircea Dinescu. Certainly, it was just as powerful and maybe even more effective. I would have liked to have more time to talk more about his role post 1989, and I think that's an important part of Pleshu's personality and Pleshu's role in modernizing Romania. I think Mihail has done an excellent job of just giving you a few tidbits on it, but I would have liked to see more of that. I would have also liked to see more in the paper of placing Pleshu within the context of dissidents in Romania pre-1999. And I think that's going to be important, since we don't know that much, especially for someone who's not familiar with all the names that you've mentioned. I think it would be particularly important to place him within the context of dissidents in Romania, and also then Romanian dissidents within the context of Eastern European anti-communist resistance. I will end by saying that I had the pleasure of actually meeting Andrei Pleshu during one of his trips in Washington, when he was an advisor to President Băsescu, and during, I think, President Băsescu's first trip to Washington. And I had the pleasure of sitting next to him at a table and having an hour-and-a-half conversation with the man. What struck me, I think, even now, but certainly then, it's that in a post-9/11 world, he seemed completely he seemed somewhat out of place. That is not to say he was not effective, and that is not to say he was not prepared, but his way of talking and his demeanor just screamed for professorship, as opposed to enhance interrogation techniques or dealing with terrorism. I think, however, that was his strength, that his clarity of arguments and his ability to clearly and effectively state some points and ideas, his training as a philosopher, served him well. And I hope, and one of the things that I very much respected about him, it was his decision, which was at times criticized by some of his friends and some other people, to actually take responsibility for the transition and for the betterment of the country. And I think getting involved in public life, as he did, even briefly, even if briefly at times, was to be commended. I'll open it up to question and answers from the audience right now, but let me just welcome the Romanian ambassador and his wife, and maybe given Andrei Pleshu's former roles, maybe if you would like to say a few words, please. If not, we'll just open it up for everyone.
Well, thank you. It's a great.
Just 1 second, we'll have the microphone right now.
Oh, I think I can speak.
Well,
No,
we're
taping.
actually taping it, and
So
it'll be on the web. It'll be more.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure being here. Actually, I don't want to take much of your time. I also like to thank Mihail Neamtu for this very interesting and comprehensive presentation of Andrei Pleshu. Let me tell you that Codrina, my wife, and I, we have worked with Andrei Pleshu. So he was our minister, and Codrina for sure was among those diplomats that Mihail Neamtu referred to, young diplomats who worked with Andrei Pleshu. I would be more cautious talking about me. And regarding the age. But let me tell you that he was impressive as a Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was also impressive as a Minister of Culture, but as Minister of Foreign Affairs, I think that I had the privilege to work with him much more closer. And it was impressive listening to him. So when Andrei Pleshu starts talking, you feel like, at least this is the way I feel, and this is the way I've been feeling. It's like feeling the philosophy and feeling the life being very tangible. You have this feeling, which is something that sometimes could be also confusing, because if you are not alert, and if you let yourself being, gone with the words that he speaks out, and if you are not there to understand or even to try to reply, you can be disappointed. But if you look at him and hear carefully, and it's something that it's an experience that you will never forget. And by the way, I remember that he was an enemy of wearing ties.
He wasn't wearing a tie. He was wearing something.
Yes, he was
which added to my confusion.
Neither wearing a tie nor a bow tie, but wearing a scarf. And I'd also, at the end, so I will stop here, and at the end I'd also like to thank Mircea Munteanu for organizing this event, and I'd also like to invite you to ask whatever questions to Mr. Neamtu. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. Can you just wait for the microphone, please?
Charlton, freelance correspondent. I have the question. With a country ban the Western book, why they let him to German twice, and also let him publish the translation work and his writing? I think most of his influence probably is his translation and writing. And second question is what's the kind of school the Patennis school is? Yeah, thank you.
What kind of school?
Thank you. First of all, I've just suggested. I think Romania had a special diplomatic relationship with the Federal Republic of Germany. I think we've recognized. Correct me if I'm wrong. In 1967, we were the first country from the socialist bloc to recognize the Federal Republic of Germany, and of course that prompted a very sort of nervous reaction from Eastern Germany. But nonetheless, we in the 70s and the 80s we received a lot of logistical support, economic support from the Germans, and the package included this mutual exchange of students. Now, Andrei Pleșu was probably one of the, he was the most brilliant mind of his generation. Even now, German philosophers and professors think that his German is just superb. When he speaks German, he's as eloquent and persuasive as when he speaks Romanian or French or English. And so it was just impossible to stop him when the agreement was there in place. Now, the second time he went with a scholarship, but he was unemployed at home, and he had 2 children, and he had the intention to come back. So I think it wasn't necessarily a favor that was done to him. The friends that he had, the friends he made in his first visit to Germany, helped him to get a second one. But again, when he came back, he was unemployed, and then he had to search for another job, and his condition was rather miserable from this point of view. He was not allowed to teach in the university, though he had all the degrees and the credentials, until 1990. This is the first answer. The second question related to the so-called Păltiniș school. Of course, this is an informal school. This is an informal school. This was an informal school which consisted only of people, not of buildings or any formal institutions there. So Constantinoica, the sage from Păltiniș, this is up in the mountains, just like Heidegger, would welcome on a weekly basis up to 10 young students. They were carefully selected, and just like again with Heidegger, nobody could approach him, literally, without without knowing German and Greek, ancient Greek. So, or at least without having started to learn the classical languages. He wanted to encourage them just to transcend the limited horizon of Romania at that time. How to transcend in those? How was it possible to transcend those horizons when the country was literally walled up, was cut off from the West? The only way, to Neukas's mind, was to be able to read manuscripts, ancient texts, to basically walk through any possible library that even the apparatchiks could not easily identify, and to basically drink from the untainted springs of ancient wisdom. I think this was a very, very clever strategy. It was painful. It was not fashionable. Some people thought of, and still think of, Constantinoica as being an elitist, but nonetheless he managed to instill courage and hope that one can, even in the most dramatic circumstances, one can transcend the limitations and the contingency. And they did. Some of them did so. That includes Andrei Pleșu and Gabriel Liceanu. Liceanu translated, got more involved into the translation project. They were at that time translating Plato, and of course, and that was done against the system and with the help of some interns, with the help of some good or well-meaning party members and professors from the University of Bucharest.
Is this you talk about the publication?
The translation of Plato, which was censured first. Now, yeah.
My basic question is this: how come his translation and writing are allowed to be published?
Oh, he had a special way of writing. Sometimes you just don't get it. He had a very cryptic and sort of elusive way of writing. All the references were stripped of any historical concreteness. For instance, he would quote from a church father, but he would not use the normal name. He would use a Latin word or a Latin name. This was one strategy. The second one, he was censored. I mean, the censorship was still active, and some of his works were not allowed to be published. And some of his books were turned down by the censorship. So I wouldn't say that he was lionized at all by anybody in those days. It was difficult.
I think it's important to remember that for someone to censor you, they need to understand what you're writing, and as long as it's not very direct. Sometimes they don't usually get it. It's one of the disadvantages of a totalitarian system that sometimes the smartest individuals don't actually join it, which is one of the advantages of democracy against it. So,
Leo Strauss' insight, sorry, just to mention this, into this esoteric dimension of writing, which of course occurs with Plato, I think should be applied to Pleșu as well.
This also shows he's very clever.
Yeah.
Questions? Yeah, right there. Can you just wait for the mic, please?
First, in a way, I'm both encouraged and still have some remaining questions after the presentation. I think in discussing Andrei Pleșu, there are two sides to it that seem to require bridging or at least clear recognition. On the one hand, he's a very prominent page or chapter in the intellectual history of of communist Romania. And on the other hand, his public intellectualism and perhaps even dissidence is somewhat of a different topic, somewhat of a different theme, and the two do not necessarily or cannot be granted to be the same. The lecture, I think, perhaps just because it requires it, no one really knowing him, that we learned a lot more about his intellectual achievements, his profundity as an intellectual, but less perhaps his public intellectualism and dissidence itself. And however, having said that, how do we define public intellectualism, and what is dissidence, especially given the conditions of the Romanian regime under communism? It's a nebulous thing. It is not a clear-cut black and white definition into which, say, a person could belong just like Michnik belongs or Havel belongs. I mean, every one of them had a particular personal history of engaging with or resisting the oppression of the regime. And obviously, it is not necessary, I thought, to somewhat liken Pleshu to everyone else. He was resisting, he was leading a public intellectual role in his own ways, to the extent that the particularly oppressive later Romanian communist regime allowed. And especially given the 20th anniversary that is coming up of the 1989 revolutions, I'd be curious to learn more, perhaps emphasize more, the public influence that he could have had or has had during those years, and since then too.
Especially, yeah.
Yeah, and earlier on you said that you could call this a movement to him leading and some of his friends. So in what way, for example, is it a movement really?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, this ties in with what Mircea said at the beginning. Maybe I should dissociate here, with your permission, between political, straightforward dissidents and cultural, oblique dissidents. And of course, in Romania we had characters like Doina Cornea, Dan Petrescu as an intellectual, but just
Mircea Dinescu or Năblandiana. I mean,
Mircea Dinescu and others who more directly challenged the regime. Andrei Pleshu would be embarrassed, because he's also a very modest person. He would be embarrassed to be called a dissident. He doesn't call himself a dissident, but he's a friend of the dissidents. So now my argument in this paper was trying to put forward this notion of cultural oblique dissidents as opposed to straightforward political dissidents, and I hope the argument stands, because you must also look at the consequences. And really what Andrei Pleshu's friends did, and he himself did, for at least two generations, my generation, but also my generation of students, but also your generation and your generation, but also people who are just now beginning to learn about 1989, what they did was they opened the windows of Romanian culture to the West. Just think of Andrei Pleshu being able to write, as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, a book about angels, which sells in 40,000 copies. Okay, think of Gabriel Iceanu, his friend, his sort of philosophical pair, again publishing books which sell in a country which is still undergoing some economic shortcomings or pressures, selling again books in thousands and thousands of copies. This is an achievement, and of course one cannot possibly imagine these intellectuals, these public intellectuals, having the resources that they have without their commuting to Păltiniș, going up into the mountains, talking on a monthly basis to Constantinoica. Basically, they didn't have, of course, postdoctoral fellowships or opportunities to go abroad for postdoctoral studies, but I think their postdoctoral research was carried under the supervision of Constantinoica. Again, maybe one of the most brilliant minds of Eastern Europe, being translated into Italian, French, and soon probably English, and we will be able to assess the depth and the impact of his thought in the region. So, without Noica, without this oblique dissidence, which means read Plato and not Marx, read Aristotle and stop, taking seriously the ideologues from the Soviet Union, doing just that makes you or prepares you for performing a hugely important role after 1989. The impact is visible. It's visible in the field of Romanian diplomacy. We have a series of people who I should like not to mention their names because I will certainly do some I'll be detrimental to others. But there are other obvious signs that he had an impact in the field of in the realm of university. There are several young scholars of religion who now, for instance, are members of the only Institute for the History of Religions, and so on and so forth. So the impact is just doubtless. But the debate must be continued, indeed.
Yeah, I think the point is well taken in terms of his dissidence. How do you define that dissidence, and how do you define his role within it? And I think in that respect that point is well taken, and I'm hoping that Mihail will revisit that idea and put it within context. Certainly his impact on Romanian society is more visible after '89. It would be interesting to find out his impact on Romanian society as a whole prior to 1989. You alluded to it, but he was losing his job or being demoted from his positions for a reason, and that wasn't just because he was traveling to Poltiniș. So there is some dissidence over there. Again, it's not the same type of dissidence that you see with Václav Havel. It is not the same type of dissidence that you see in Romania with Nescu. It's not strident. It's not in your face. But I just can't imagine Pleshu going on the barricades. His personality wouldn't.
His temperament.
His temperament wouldn't be suited to that. So his dissidence is somewhat different, and I hope to find out more about it. And I think it would be important for you to go back to this and sort of address that more clearly.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
thank you.
Then we're all going to stop here.
Thank you very much.
Very much appreciate it, and thank you all for coming.